Ultimately, if we were going to try to come up with a more scientific way to either compare two songwriters or to measure our own growth as a songwriter and see if we are actually improving, I think what we would come up with is basically two measurements. One would be the average quality of our songs, and the other one would be the throughput of our songs. So put basically, how good our songs are on average would be quality, and then the throughput is basically just over a certain period of time, how many do we complete? Maybe an intuitive way to look at this is if we were to say, hey, both of these songwriters write songs that we would grade at an 85%, or something, let's give it a B, but one of them writes 100 songs a year and the other one writes 50 songs a year, we likely would say the one that writes 100 songs a year is actually better. I don't know what the ratio is between quality and quantity or throughput, but ultimately that illuminates that if we are going to improve as songwriters, there are two basic things we need to look at. One is the quality of our songs. Most of what we talk about on this channel is about quality of songs and increasing the quality. But the other important thing is increasing the throughput. So in this episode, we're going to talk about how to write songs faster. One way I've found that I think results in writing songs overall faster is writing the music before you write the lyrics. Now, there are several reasons for this, and one of those, I believe, is the fact that most of us as songwriters tend to be more musicians than we are poets. And we tend to be people that ultimately were musicians that wanted to write songs and therefore started to learn about writing poetry in order to have lyrics for our songs, but are primarily people who are musicians, not necessarily writers of words. Not only that, but I think just overall, it is easier to improvise good sounding music than it is to improvise good sounding poetry. Now, you and I can probably put together relatively coherent, regular sentences together because basically what I'm doing right now is improvising words in a sense, but they're far from something that one would consider poetic. But on the other side, learning to improvise music that actually sounds pretty good right away is actually relatively trivial. If you're decent at your instrument and have a basic knowledge of music theory, such as, for example, understanding what the key of C major means and knowing that the notes you have are C, D, E, F, G, A, B, basically no sharps or flats, and also knowing within the context of that key the job of a C major chord versus a G major chord versus a D minor chord. Once you know those things, it's actually relatively trivial as long as you're a decent instrumentalist to be able to improvise something that sounds pretty decent right off the top of your head. But for all but the most elite of poets, most people can't just improvise poetry that is good from the outset. And now you might be saying, rightfully so, that Joseph, it doesn't really matter which one is faster. Ultimately, I have to do them both. And that's true. But I would argue that actually once you have music, it is easier to write lyrics that fit into your music than it is to write music that fits into your lyrics. And I think this goes back to my first point, which is that most of us are primarily musicians. And it also connects to that second point, where I think it's just easier to improvise music than it is lyrics. So we can quickly get some pretty good sounding music together. And then that music can really help us figure out exactly what to do lyrically. For example, once you have a melody, you already know what your constraints are for the syllables you can have per line, which is a helpful constraint because basically you're now putting a puzzle together in a sense. You know, okay, I need 5 syllables in this first line of the melody. So now we know that our first line in our lyrics needs to have 5 words. So ultimately, at least for me and probably for you, you'll likely find that it is easier to have a piece of music and figure out from there, like, okay, this is generally what this song sounds like it would be about. So that can help figure out the lyrical subject of the song. And then from there, as I mentioned with the melody, you already are constrained to certain syllables, which helps you to sort of naturally figure out the poetic meter because it's already contained in the music that you improvised and the music that you wrote. But ultimately, this is going to come down to one question for you, which is for you, which is easier to translate from music to lyrics, to listen to music and figure out this is what the song should be about, this is what the song is saying? Or is it easier for you to translate from lyrics to music? Now, for most of us, I believe the answer is going to be that first one. And ultimately, that's why it's going to end up being the faster methodology rather than trying to struggle through just writing a poem and then figuring out, okay, how do I put this to music? Whereas writing music relatively quickly, if you know what you're doing as a musician and understand basic music theory, tends to be on the more trivial side, or at least certainly is much faster than starting with lyrics. And then it actually is something that can really help you write lyrics faster ultimately. Well, I don't think necessarily writing lyrics first ends up helping you write music any faster. Another way to write songs faster is to record your song as you go. Now, there's several factors to this one, but one of them is simply the fact that it is easier to write something better and faster when you only have to worry about one thing at a time. So, for example, if you are having to play the guitar riff that you've written so far and then improvise with your voice at the same time, it's going to be harder for you to concentrate on improvising with your voice and figuring out the melody while your brain is also trying to, remember how to play your riff. Think about it this way. Why is it that ultimately lead singers over time tend to, even if they started with playing instruments, they tend to eventually just be standing on stage with a mic? It's so common for there to be a 4-piece band with a lead singer that plays rhythm guitar, and then a lead guitarist and a bass guitarist and a drummer. And then eventually they become a 5-piece band because they actually end up having 2 guitarists and the vocalist only does vocals, or maybe rarely brings out an acoustic guitar and does a really simple part. Why is that? The reason tends to be that it's just easier for them to concentrate on crushing their vocal performance if they only have to concentrate on one thing at a time. If they have to concentrate on playing the piano well or the guitar well while also trying to stay on pitch and deliver a good performance, make sure to sing the melody not just on pitch but with feeling and emotion, it's easier to do that if that's all you have to worry about. So that's also going to be true for writing. If you're worried about strumming that new chord progression you just came up with while also trying to improvise your vocal line and what's going to ultimately become your melody, it's going to be harder to do that, and certainly harder to come up with a better melody faster compared to if you actually take the time to take the 5-10 minutes, record that guitar part that you've written, even if it's just on your phone. Even literally just recording your guitar part on your phone and then playing it back and then just sit there and just improvise the melody. That's going to be unbelievably easier to write something well and to write it faster than it is when you're forcing yourself to do both at the same time. A bonus benefit to this concept of recording as we go is it makes you less limited on what instrument you can use to actually come up with the new part. So, for example, the most typical thing probably is something like you are writing your guitar part or your piano part, and then from there, after you come up with the chord progression or the piano riff or the guitar riff, now you're coming up with your vocal melody. So in that instance, let's say you came up with a piano riff. From there, now you're trying to figure out a vocal melody. But it might be the case that you are actually better at writing melodies with the piano than you are with your voice. Or it might be the case that you're better at writing melodies with your guitar because maybe you're a really good soloist, you're a good lead guitarist. So it's actually easier for you to write interesting, cool, melodic melodies with your guitar than it is with your voice. Well, if you've recorded that guitar part or piano part, and now you're just listening back to it and improvising the melody, and that's all you have to do, even if your original part was on the piano, you can go back to the piano and now just use your right hand and pluck out the melody. Right? You don't have to write it with your voice because you're not using your left and right hand to actually play the piano riff. You're listening to it as a recording. And the same thing's true for guitar. If you already recorded your chord progression or your guitar riff, then you can just listen back to it, grab that same guitar, and now you're just doing a solo to find your melody, which can be really helpful. At least for me personally, I am best at writing melodies, yes, vocal melodies with the piano. So I tend to do this all the time. It's actually fairly rare at this point that I write melodies with my voice. I tend to sing it while I'm writing it, sort of to figure out, hey, is this singable? Does it sound as good when I'm singing it as it does with the keyboard or the piano? Sure, but ultimately my main instrument for improvising, for finding that melody, is the piano. Also, as a second bonus, in case it's not obvious, if your ultimate goal is to end up releasing this song, if you are recording as you write, that means as you're writing the song, you're already building up the recording. So you don't have to do that as a whole separate process later. In fact, you can actually be slowly recording while you're writing, and then soon, by the time you're done writing the song, you might realize, hey, this song's already half recorded or more. And I kind of got that for free because I was just doing it as I went along, which is a lot better and tends to be a lot less soul-crushing than taking 6 months to write a song, and it's kind of a struggle, and then you're like, now it's time to start recording, and you have nothing recorded so far. It's kind of soul-crushing when that happens. Much better if it took you 6 months to write that song, but hey, at least it's already halfway recorded. Now you just have to finish recording it. And another way to write songs faster is to break up lyric writing into smaller baby steps. One of the biggest problems with lyric writing is people don't break it down into steps. They basically look at a blank page and say to themselves, all right, improvise poetry, which of course is asking quite a bit from ourselves. Almost nobody, or to maybe nobody at all, who is an artist that utilizes words, do they expect themselves to nail it with a first draft, right? The books that you love reading, that is not the first draft. In fact, it is probably significantly different than the first draft, and it had several edits that happened after it, some by the author, some by the editor. It might be version 20 that you ended up reading, certainly not something that the author originally improvised. So sometimes it may seem unnecessary to do some baby steps with lyric writing and actually start with not writing lyrics, but doing some background work, like finding pictures that sort of give the emotion that you want the song to have, or by doing some prose writing where you're just literally writing as if it's a diary in regular old English. Ultimately, you're just writing without the constraints and without the pressure of like, okay, it needs to rhyme and it needs to have a certain meter to it and it needs to sound poetic. No, just write. And it may seem counterintuitive to do steps before you even start lyric writing, and it actually results in you being more efficient at lyric writing, but it's sort of the concept of measure twice, cut once. Sure, each cut of wood will take more time when you force yourself to measure twice rather than once, but ultimately, the amount of cuts you will make that have a mistake will go down drastically because you cut twice. Now, in a similar way, ultimately, I find that if you break the lyric writing process down into smaller steps that are all easier to accomplish, it helps you push through the barriers of some of the harder parts of lyric writing, and also just allows you to, in the end, write a better lyric that also happened faster than if you just keep forcing yourself to try to improvise good poetry just by looking at a blank page. So if that seems interesting to you, you can check out my free guide on my 6-step lyric writing checklist, where I break down the 6 steps that I go through when lyric writing that has helped me personally with being able to write lyrics more efficiently, which is important to me because frankly, that is easily my bottleneck when it comes to my song throughput. I could write maybe a song every 2 days if it was just music, but it's lyrics that ultimately makes it so that I can only write so many songs per month or per year. So that being the bottleneck, that's the thing that was really important to me to be able to speed up, but I also wanted to make sure I wasn't compromising on quality, because quality lyrics is super important to me, and hopefully it's important to you as well. And if that sounds like something that you would also like to experience, that you can increase the throughput of lyrics, you can increase how many lyrics you can write, but also not compromise on quality, this is the free guide for you. Again, it breaks down the 6 steps that I personally go through that helps me ultimately end up writing lyrics faster, but also maintaining a really, really high quality. So it should help with both quality and throughput, which are the 2 things we talked about at the beginning of this video. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. I'll talk to you in the next one.